Tony mentioned our next speaker, Joe Stoy, who's another person from Oxford. He was originally a physicist, studied physics at Oxford, so perhaps he can tell us something about Maxwell's equations as well as core logic. He worked with Christopher Strachey at the Programming Research Group, and I think he's probably the longest serving member of the Programming Research Group in Oxford, joining in 1967. And he tells me the reason why he joined was that they had a very good party, which I think they called the symposium in those days, and he stayed ever since. So he's going to tell us something about the beginnings of formal semantics at Oxford. Joe.
Jonathan's taken my first story. I want to cover, if I may, the history of formal semantics at Oxford between the time the Programming Research Group started and, shall we say, the time that Tony Hoare arrived there in 1977. As has just been said, I first became aware of the Programming Research Group by being invited to its inaugural party. I was then a graduate physicist doing calculations in Algol 60 in low temperature antiferromagnetism, and also one of the little team, along with Dave Holdsworth, who's just spoken, who ran the KDF9 in the evenings now and again in order to clear the backlog. And I think that's how I got invited to the party. But the story of the PRG goes back a little bit before that. Like some of these creation myths where the universe starts as the result of a cosmic battle, the PRG started because Leslie Fox, a very kind man who was very good to me and was very nice, but had at that stage a fairly blinkered view of computers, wrote an article in the Computer Journal in 61, 62, when the universities were beginning to apply for their second round of machines. In this period, Oxford had a Mercury machine. Its index registers were Mercury delay lines. It was very new and up to the minute. It had 500 words of core store. It had 32,000 words of secondary storage on a drum. The drum had to go round in sync with the processor clock. So getting the drum up to speed and in phase was a job for the maintenance engineers. You couldn't just switch it on. 150 kilowatts, I think, mean time between a valve going wrong, about 20 minutes. Cooling by frigid air, coach work by Rolls-Royce. It was that kind of machine. And the universities were trying to get new machines, and Leslie Fox was concerned that these machines shouldn't be used for trivial, frivolous purposes, like teaching undergraduates how to program. Nobody should have unaided access to a computer who can't do the numerical analysis himself. Otherwise, he should have his hand held by a numerical analyst. And indeed, that happened in Oxford for many years. You couldn't get an account on the machine unless you had talked to a numerical analyst. You see the red rags to bulls. Programming more important than mathematics in the sense it is mathematics. Well, it caused Stan Gill and Christopher Strachey to jump into the correspondence column of the Computer Journal. Some of it was sort of attacking rhetoric, but they also set out the principles that we're going to lead their work later. Does not practical work on such a scale inevitably call for theoretical studies? Are these not mathematics? Actually, in their long letter, the part they developed more than anything else wasn't actually semantics of programming languages theory. It was more theory of algorithms. They took that as the first example, the prime example of what they would want to study and thought ought to be taught and was a reputable subject. Fox got a little bit of support from a perhaps unexpected quarter. Here's a salvo from Norway, suggesting that one would never teach undergraduates without compilers. But this point about undergraduates was relevant in the letter. They thought that the idea that 5 out of the 11 computers at MIT, this is 62, MIT had 11 computers, and 5 of them were being used to teach undergraduates. When I first went to MIT, which was in 73, MIT's spending on computing research was greater than the United Kingdom's. And there they had 11 computers. And indeed, Fox agreed that, yes, this would be extravagant, and MIT's letting undergraduate students on computers would not produce an adequate return. But still, Leslie was a fair man, and he made the offer that he would organise a summer school. There had been 2 previous ones, one on computing and crystallography, one on partial differential equations. He'd organise this one on whatever they like to call it. In other words, it was a put up and shut up, put up or shut up challenge, and indeed they put up. And a very successful summer school was held, which became that set of proceedings. I should say that I brought a few memorabilia over on that table, which you're welcome to look at, but though some of them are the only copies, so don't please take them. One of the things there, incidentally, is the formal language description languages proceedings, which Tony Hall mentioned just a moment ago. Barron and Strachey did about a third of the lectures of this summer school on programming. Peter Landin contributed to it, and it was one of the seminal volumes when I first joined the programming research group. Here are a few more works which were around at the time I first became involved with the work of the group. There was Peter's paper on the mechanical evaluation of expressions using the lambda notation to express the semantics of programming languages and defining a machine, the SECD machine, to give it a robust implementation and an operational semantics. There was this book which we've been talking about, the proceedings of that Vienna conference, which Strachey had contributed to. Peter had put another version of that in, and there were many other schools contributing to that conference. One school that isn't really represented here is the symbol manipulators, let us call them, the Algol school. I remember a later crack of Strachey's saying how that particular school reached its climax in the definition of Algol 68, defined by a process which assigned meaning to it, though he said the authors would certainly shun such terminology as meaning, by a process which he said was rightly called elaboration. There was interesting controversies which you can see in the proceedings because the verbatim discussions were recorded in the book. There was also the pedagogic algorithmic language taught by Wozencraft and Evans at MIT, and Strachey had been at MIT for a year or so before he finally came to Oxford to start the PRG. And the PAL language was influenced his ideas. It was a very general language. Every type of object was a first-class citizen in the language, including, in particular, the jump. So you could assign a jump because it was a first-class citizen. You could assign a label, that is to say, to a global variable. And then once you had it assigned in that global variable, you could simply go to it. Even if it was half an hour after you had left the procedure call, during which the label was set. So you could jump back into the procedure half an hour backwards. As he says there, it causes a lot of fun, makes backtracking easy, it comes almost for free, but it's absolute hell to implement, of course, because you can't do anything on a stack anymore. Everything has to stay around forever. Well, this was the background when I joined the PRG. Actually, the way I did it was at this party, Christopher showed me a preprint of a code generator for the BCPL compiler, which Martin Richards was writing at MIT. Christopher had written a code generator in BCPL for the KDF9, the Oxford's machine. So I took my copy away and I transliterated it into Algol 60 and got it up and running. And then with Christopher's aid, we got the semi-compiled, the O code of the BCPL compiler from MIT on punch cards. I remember it was misaddressed. It crossed the Atlantic 2.5 times before it actually got to us. And anyway, I got the compiler compiled, bootstrapped up and running, gave it to Christopher and asked him for a job. And that was in '67, and I've been there ever since. When I got there, the PRG had just started, and there were perhaps 3 initial concerns going on. One was the CPL effort. CPL, Cambridge Programming Language originally. London University joined in, George Caloris's group, so it became the combined programming language. And when I joined the group, the CPL meetings were still going on from time to time. Robin Poppleston would come down from Edinburgh on his motorbike. There was one winter meeting where we had to send him away to thaw out before he could make any reasonable contribution. The Cambridge team, led by Christopher, got diverted from the job of writing an operational compiler for the Cambridge Titan, which is what they were supposed to be doing. Though Martin Richards did produce a compiler, it was more written for the sake of finding out things about how to write compilers than to be a very efficient job. Titan had to use another language, Titan autocode, much to Maurice Wilkes's exasperation, I think you could fairly say. The London effort did produce a serviceable compiler. But the fact that there were 2 completely different compilers written from 2 completely different sets of guidelines meant that there was no falling back on the language being defined by the compiler business that Tony was going on about. And so that meant that the CPL team had to think about how to express the semantics of the language, what the language meant. And that diverted the team from the actual implementation business. However, there were 2 products worth talking about, 2 sets of products. One was Strachey's seminal work, I think, on the fundamental concepts of programming languages. I've got a TypeScript over there. It's finally, 25 years later, actually been published last year in high order and symbolic computation. It is, of course, a little bit dated now, but it's still worth having a look at and guided the design of many languages. POP2, British artificial intelligence language. The work on the CPL compiler done in assembly code with McGregor generator, also another Strachey invention, led Martin Richards to propose in an appendix that it would be a good idea to bootstrap the compiler by starting with a simple language, CPL with all the bits that were difficult to compile left out. So types and full block structure, non-local variables, and various things like that. And that was basic CPL, a language which had a longer life than CPL itself. The inventors of Unix took a version of BCPL called B as their initial implementation language, and when they wanted the next one, it was called C. I was always wondering whether the next one would be D or P, as it ought to have been, but in fact, they played a pun in the language itself, and it was C++. So there we are. So that was one effort. You see, not really formal semantics, not formal verification, but getting informally interested in the underlying concepts. There were also programming experiments going on. This is what I was more involved with to start with. Again, playing with structures that nowadays are recognizable as object-oriented programming things, but less crystallized in those days. And thirdly, there was the work on formal semantics. They used lambda notation. One of the things I hope that Peter will reminisce about is another of the creation myths of this subject, at least one of my creation myths, on which I've dined out on from time to time. And that is the unsung hero, who I think was called Melvin Pragnel. Yeah, okay, so there's a chance we'll get it. He, in the version I tell after dinners, and I'm hoping I'm going to be either corrected or confirmed, he used to hang around the mathematical logic counter in foils, and anytime he found anyone actually taking an interest in the books, would inveigle them into his reading parties. What that meant was that Britain had a number of people who'd read the relevant literature, in particular Church, but also Frege and other people, and were ready to apply it when the right moment came along. So all hail to Melvin Pragnel. Lambda notation was in use. Strachey said that it was Roger Penrose, Black Hole's man, who first suggested to Strachey that lambda notation might be a useful thing to think about in connection with computer languages. Ron Burstall had the idea of treating the store as a function from locations to contents. There were sequencing, semicolon, was done by functional composition. And for loops, jumps, and recursion, they used fixed points using Curry's Y Combinator, of which more in a minute. Now, they were using lambda notation. Christopher, in his paper Informal Language Description Languages, I'm slightly, yes, every time I look at that watch, it says the same time. I'm slightly worrying about. Strachey, you see, was saying that if you had a few more basic, concepts, like the store being a function from location to contents and fixed points and so on, you could describe even the imperative parts of a programming language in a purely applicative way. And he claimed it's no longer an essential part of the semantics of the language to postulate an evaluating mechanism. Now, there's a bit of hand-waving and bluster going on there at that stage in 66 or whatever it was. Because if you asked what the lambda calculus meant, you either went to the conversion rules, the reduction rules, or you went to Peter's SECD machine. In other words, it was defined by an evaluating mechanism. In the Formal Language Description Languages paper, Christopher does come to the point and say that about the paradoxical combinator, there's no guarantee that when you apply it to something you get a sensible answer. And he says, well, the SECD machine provides a robust way of giving a sensible answer when there is a sensible answer, and that covers all the uses in semantics of programming languages. There's a kind of loose end there that he's hand-waving about. I should say that Peter also produced in that volume a description of Algol 60 in terms of the SECD machine, but his approach was different from Christopher's. He wasn't defining the imperative parts in terms of applicative expressions. He put some imperative primitives into the SECD machine, an assigning thing, a program point, to do the jumps. So the approach was a little bit different. Well, in Oxford, 67, a few years onwards, Christopher happily continued to use the lambda notation to describe the semantics of programming languages and lectured about it, and wasn't too worried about the lack of any real mathematical semantics to the lambda notation. He knew his functions existed, didn't need anyone to prove it for him, and he wasn't too worried about it. Fortunately, what happened is that he met Dana Scott at a conference in Vienna in early '69 and persuaded Dana to come to Oxford for the Michaelmas term of that year, which was a very, very exciting term. We had weekly seminars on the theory of computation, scheduled for an hour, but they usually went on for 2 or 3. And towards the end, Dana would always say, "Oh, I'm so tired," he would say, but he would carry on anyway. And the subject developed during that term. At the beginning of the term, we had a TypeScript copy over there, though it's now withdrawn by Dana. A type theoretical alternative to the Curry Church system, like the lambda calculus. Peter Landin's language, I swim if you see what I mean. And this one was Dana's or what have you. And he apologized to Peter for, with his little footnote, for doing that. But you see what he was saying at the beginning of the term. Curry and Quine and Church and so on are very lucky that their unmotivated formalistic systems are not inconsistent. They don't mean anything, so you couldn't really expect them to be consistent. Formalism without eventual interpretation, perhaps not immediately, but eventual, is in the end useless. It may turn out that the lambda calculus means something, and he spent more days than he cares to remember trying to find a meaning, but until that date, we should give up using the pure lambda calculus, the untyped lambda calculus, and go into a system involving types. And there was a third quotation that didn't fit on that slide, saying that, in his view, the type-free theory makes no sense whatsoever. Christopher's been using it all the time. But, so Dana set off in the term trying to clean up Christopher's use of the type-free lambda calculus by putting the types in everywhere. Halfway through the term, we got to the idea of computable domains. A domain is a structure that has all these properties. He's bringing computability into the system. His domains, as well as having all the values they need to have a basis in terms of which you can express all the other elements, the love of a set of basis elements. And what's more, the basis is countable, so that you can say, well, if the set of basis elements you're approximating is recursively enumerable, then you can computably generate it, and so you can get a notion of computability. So that was about halfway through the term. There was then a stage which I haven't got a document from anymore, where he reckoned that in order to try and make sense of what Christopher was doing, one had to put in representation and derepresentation functions all over the place, and the formalism got incredibly messy and intractable. But by the end of term, we got to this stage. This is a slightly later paper describing the end of term. He came to the conclusion that there was no getting away from it. Strachey wanted the type-free lambda calculus. You could, commands were functions which changed the state of the store. So a command was a store-to-store function, but you could store commands in the store. And once you've got into that complication, then unless you go into girdle numbering or something like that, which was briefly thought about, and after all, what is a compiler but something that takes a command, a function from store to store, and produces an enormous great binary number, the machine code, which you can think of as a girdle number if you want. It's about the same length as the average girdle number. But anyway, that eventually was rejected. Once Dana had defined the domain and got it so that a function space would be a domain of the same kind. Of course, 10 years later, Cartesian enclosed categories expressed all this nicely, but this was before that. It was only a matter of time that Dana invented the limit construction.
Same time as
In Oxford, no, but yes. I'm sorry, I was taking the okay. Came up with the limit construction, as he says, it's no worse than the real numbers. The real numbers being a real number being thought of theoretically as a limit of a sequence of rational approximations. The reflexive domain construction being no worse than that. This was very exciting. Christopher immediately told the SRC about it. Actually, he reporting out of turn because it was really the following academic year, but he couldn't resist putting it in the report of the year before. Now one could go on with great confidence and enthusiasm and vim and so on, and a whole load of technical monographs came out from the principles there. The first one outlining the theory of reflexive domains, another one giving some more lattice theory, the first one to apply this theory to actually to describing mathematical semantics, as we called it then, because it had a mathematical foundation. There were some paper tigers going on here. There was people feeling that this was mathematical semantics. Operational semantics wasn't really mathematical, and axiomatic semantics was in such danger of being inconsistent that we didn't think much of that either. This was before, of course, we've got a more integrated view about the whole theory. Continuous lattices was a monograph really putting the whole thing into a topological framework where it fits very nicely, but us physicists and so on were not really able to take that as easily as some of the other ways of talking about it. And then finally, Christopher used the notation to compare two programming languages, one Algol and Powell. Notice the varieties of programming language, deliberately imitating the varieties of religious experience, and the monograph has a parody of the preface as its preface. That's why that's singular. So that was the first set of monographs. Later on, Dana produced another one, which had been predicted for several years, called Data Types as Lattices, published in 1975 in the end, in memory of Christopher Strachey, who died in May 1975. In that monograph, also published in the Siam Journal, Dana introduced a different model for the lambda calculus, which avoided the complexities of the limit construction, the reflexive domain construction, and instead expressed the domain in terms of sets of integers. It was the power set of integers, the p omega model. Computability, I think, was also a bit easier to incorporate, but the whole thing was less intuitive, less complex, but less intuitive. And this was the model that I used in my book, which was based on lectures I gave at MIT, relying heavily on Scott's lectures and Strachey's lectures, in the sabbatical year I spent there in 73-4, but they invited me there, I think, partly to hear about denotational semantics. When I published it finally in 77, it incorporated the p omega model. It went out of date fairly soon. I mean, it stayed in print for 25 years, but it's finally been remaindered. There were several reasons it went out of date quite quickly, I think. One is that, like p omega, I used lattices, not complete partial orderings. It made mathematics, in a way, more elegant to have all the upper bounds there, but it got in the way of people who wanted to do fully abstract semantics, with, where the extra values around were a bit of an embarrassment. The p omega model, as I say, was not as intuitive as it might have been, and was soon replaced by a construction called neighbourhoods, which I think was more intuitive. My book has a purple passage in it, motivating continuity, for example, which comes much more naturally if you're in the neighbourhoods framework. And finally, the book combined both the mathematical theory and the application to programming languages definition in a way which you had to do to start with because it was the beginnings. But now, just as people who do real arithmetic don't also learn about Cauchy convergent sequences, that's a different subject. So now domain theory and programming language definition are two different subjects. Well, that was what the masters were doing, but there were also brilliant graduate students in the group, and here are some of them. For example, Chris Wadworth, the first batch of graduate students we had, produced thesis also over there, the semantics and pragmatics of the lambda calculus, doing two things, you see, proving some theoretical consistency-inconsistency results, the equality of some expressions with normal forms to other expressions without normal forms in the interpretation in the model, but also setting out graph reduction, the implementation technique for lazy functional languages, which has been enormously important since. So that's a good example of the PRG's attempt right from the beginning, right from Strachey's original conception of it, to combine theory with practice. Similarly, Peter Moss's produced a thesis in '73 on compiler generation, his semantics implementation system, using the denotational definitions of used in implementation. But on the way, he produced a monograph doing the semantics of Algol 60 in his new formalism. There was Robert Milne. Actually, he was a Cambridge graduate student but working in Oxford, and produced a very heavyweight thesis. Again, it's over there. It's heavyweight partly because it's photocopied on zinc paper, but if you look at it, you'll see it's heavyweight in the other sense as well. Formal semantics, you see one of these clever titles, semantically ambiguous. The formal semantics of implementation as much as the formal semantics of the language itself. I'll come back to the Adams essay. There was David Turner, who started in '69 doing a thesis on implementing PAL, which, as I said earlier, was a dreadfully complicated language to implement, and he never got to the end of that. Instead, he turned his mind to simpler and more useful languages. The St Andrews set language, I think that was. And more useful languages. The St Andrews set language, I think that was called SASL, and then the Kent recursive calculator, KRC, and then Miranda. And when he was at Kent, I heard that he was proposing to write the KRC work up for a PhD at Kent. And I said to him, look, you were a graduate student at Oxford, you damn well write up your thesis for Oxford. We want our SELC statistics to... what the SELC would take think these days of a 12-year period, I don't know. Anyway, so I remember, if I'm allowed to be anecdotal, that there were 2 consecutive DPhil orals I was internal examiner for. And in both of them, I was able to start the oral by saying, well now, Professor. One was David, the other was Cliff. We also had George Ligler was a Rhodes Scholar, and again, you see, he turned his mind to the connection between the denotational semantics and proof rules. So we were, whereas Michael Harrison started before Christopher died, was into the business of equivalence of computer programs. All these are theses in the formal verification kind of area. There were other ones in gathering statistics and so on for designing computer mechanisms, machine codes, compiling structures and so on. And many other graduate students as well after Christopher's time. So I might just mention John Hughes here, who, although his DPhil was well after Christopher's time, he was one of the succession of people whom Christopher employed in their gap year between school and university. So we started working on John Hughes as a schoolboy. He went to Cambridge to do his first degree, came back to Oxford for his doctorate, and then was on our faculty briefly before going off to be professor at Glasgow and then at Sweden. Christopher knew that people in their gap year would want to relax from the discipline of school, so the only rule was that they had to be in by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They tended then to work all night. So that was what the theory was doing. Christopher, by 1973, was still a little bit concerned that the theory hadn't been taken over by industry. And apart from his realistic view of human nature, he thought that languages were too complicated and the problems were too big. And this is a theme that has come up now several times, you see. Tony was talking about it, and David Turner's work, it was only when he simplified PAL to a simpler language that he could actually get anywhere with it. And I think one of the themes that's come out of the PRG's work has been the drive towards simplicity in programming language design. Keep it simple, stupid, or as we prefer to put it in Oxford, Entier nonsum can fight in hesitate. Occam's razor. And of course, Occam, the language, is designed by Tony when he came to Oxford on CSP, based very much on these lines. Keep the thing rigorously simple. And I think it's also inspired Oxford's interest in functional programming, languages which are simple enough that you can really do theory with them. Now let me come back to the Adams essay, which was the end of at the end of Christopher's life, his last big work. It was a prize essay for Cambridge. It didn't actually win the prize, and he wrote it with Robert Milne, people of two rather different styles. Here are two quotations from the essay, and perhaps you can work out which is which. Here's one, both initial paragraphs of sentences. One purpose of the theory of computing is to give an accurate correspondence between programs and mathematical entities. These entities belong to particular sets known as domains on which are imposed partial orderings. Until section 2.2.1, these orderings will be irrelevant. Here we need only, and so on. And here's the beginning of another sentence of another paragraph of the section. And you can perhaps see that trying to unify the style of these two was a very difficult task. And I think Christopher trying to assimilate both styles into a similar work, I think it took an enormous amount out of him. He was working very hard that last year. He'd also actually lost a lot of weight, which he was very proud of, but I think it meant that since this drove him to use whiskey rather more, I think that was part of the reason for his premature death. They couldn't resist having the reminiscence about the paper tiger. Just people who, despite having little familiarity with mathematical semantics, sometimes an open hostility to it, but nevertheless want to advocate the banning of jumps, have so often chosen as their preferred constructs those which come very easily, can be validated very easily in terms of the fixed points and limits, but virtually impossible in the other sense. I'm not quite sure whom they're getting at there, but I could have a bit of a guess. After Christopher died, Robert Milne took the essay and rewrote it in his style, which makes it a fairly difficult book to read. An interesting thing about it is that the publishers got carried away in their legalistic rhetoric at the beginning, and forbade anyone to use it for any purpose anyway. Even I think for propping the door open, you see it can't be reproduced or utilised in any case.
Are you allowed to project it on the screen?
Well, that's just the copyright now, isn't it? Fortunately, perhaps the set of us who, for whom that gives rise to severe moral problems is, on the whole, rather small. Perhaps that's the note at which we...
Are you sure you're permitted to reproduce?
Well, now how old would that be now? The copyright? Well, I don't know. I won't get into copyright law, but perhaps that's a note on which to end.
Are there any questions? Can I remind you to say your name before you ask a question, please?
I'm Roger Jones. I'm puzzled by your description of Scott's reasons for getting into the name field. You seem to say that he seriously doubted the consistency of the lambda calculus.
No, he accepted, of course, the Church-Rosser theorems had shown that the lambda calculus was consistent. The problem was that it didn't have any model except the, trivial model of its own syntactic self. The reduction rules were consistent. The church numeral 0 could never be converted into the church numeral 1. But to think about it as meaning something to do with functions was an improper step which he wasn't prepared to go into. It was a system that was like the glass bead game. It was a system that was rattling round, doing its own thing, but had no relevance to anything else until you could give it an interpretation. And that only happened in '69.
Any other questions?
small anecdote. I'm George Davis. This story started with Leslie Fox's, what I might say, intransigence in regard to computers. And I could go back on this to NPL when I was sort of attached there in Maths Division. And one day they said the decision had been made that the senior people in NPL Maths Division were going to be taught programming by the juniors. And I had won first prize. I was going to teach Dr. Fox. Anyway, we had our first session and he produced his first program. It didn't work. So I looked at it and I said he had to put the two instructions on the opposite arms of a conditional jump in adjacent memory locations. He said, well, he didn't want to put them in adjacent memory locations. And I said, well, you've got to put them in adjacent memory locations. It said so in the programming manual, which I had written. And, he said he didn't want to be dictated to by someone who wasn't really a member of laboratory staff at all, and that was the end of the matter. As far as I know, he never learned to program. And that was probably the origins of his attitude to stuff. So I think something you could say, in a way, that the Oxford Programming Research Group arose indirectly from my powers of diplomacy.
That reminds me of, oh dear, 3 stories. One is that when Leslie Fox retired, we gave him a nickel-plated Brunsviga, which seemed absolutely appropriate. It is now in a glass case in the computing lab at Oxford. Second story is that when we went, much later, as I went with the computing service team to look at big installations in the United States, we found differences in culture. A particular difference in culture between MIT and CMU. MIT both had advisory services available online if you had problems with your computers. At MIT they put whoever they could find, a 4th-year undergraduate or something, and the chap or the girl dealt with whichever questions came along the wire. At CMU they were much more worried about if a dean had a question, then perhaps it shouldn't be answered by an undergraduate. And that was completely different from MIT. The third story is about Christopher Strachey getting a reputation for being very good at debugging programs, and he told me how it worked. It depended on whether it was one of his own programs or somebody else's program. If it was somebody else's program, he would say, now, tell me how it worked. And then he would sit and think about something else, like Beethoven's symphony or something like that. And the victim would start describing his program in detail and would suddenly say, oh, I see. And Christopher would smile sweetly. If it was his own program, he would give it to the most junior member of the department, usually the schoolboy programmer. The junior would be so concerned to gain kudos by finding the bug in the big professor's program that untold amounts of energy would be spent doing it, and the bug would be found.
Any other questions or reminiscences?
Well, if I can make another reminiscence, I'm reminded of this by what George said, because one of the activities, I would say achievements, of the Elliott Algol programming team was that we were invited in about 1963, I think, to give a programming course to members of Parliament. And 2 or 3 803s were ceremoniously taken into a committee room in the House of Commons, were set up and got to work, and we had, I don't know, a dozen, 15 lot of MPs came along and they sat down and we gave them a basic Algol programming course. What effect that has had on British politics since, I don't know, but that was, I think, the first time, and probably the only time, that MPs have been subjected to the Algol programming language.
I remember a time we had a big politician, I was the chairman of the Science Research Council, coming to have dinner with Strachey in Wolfson College, which was then just across the road from the programming research group. And we got a version of the Eliza Doctor program working. I programmed it in BCPL. And so after dinner they came across and with their brandy and cigars and so on, and started playing with Eliza. And finally, was it Flowers? Somebody, it might have been Flowers. So, well, Christopher, why do we give you all this, these grants to spend? doing things like this. And so Christopher said, well, let's ask the machine. So he typed it in, and the computer said, what answer would please you most?
I think that's probably a good note to finish on before we go to tea.